Michelle Carter was not the kind of person who liked to sit back and let things happen. At 34 years old, she had already made a name for herself as a civil rights attorney, someone who fought hard for justice, especially when it came to protecting people of color from unfair treatment. She wasn't afraid to take on tough cases, even if they meant going up against powerful institutions or standing in front of judges who didn't always see eye to eye with her. But today felt different. Today was about more than just another case. It was about proving something bigger. The small southern town where Michelle found herself that morning wasn't exactly known for fairness or equality. In fact, many locals whispered stories about how the police department operated with little oversight, often targeting black residents during traffic stops or arrests without proper cause. It was one of those stories that had brought Michelle here to defend a young man named Jamal, who was accused of assaulting an officer during what should have been a routine traffic stop. According to Jamal's account, he hadn't done anything wrong. He said the officer became aggressive first, escalating the situation unnecessarily until it spiraled out of control. Unfortunately, no one else seemed willing to listen to his side of the story, except Michelle. As Michelle stepped out of her car outside the courthouse, she took a deep breath. The air smelled faintly of rain, though dark clouds still loomed overhead. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she walked toward the entrance, clutching her briefcase tightly. Inside that leather case were months' worth of research, notes, and evidence, all carefully organized to help her make her argument in court. This wasn't just preparation, it was armor. Every document, every witness statement, every piece of proof she carried with her represented hope, not just for Jamal, but for everyone watching this case closely. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere buzzed with tension. Reporters milled around near the entrance, their cameras slung over their shoulders, waiting for any hint of drama. Spectators sat quietly in rows of wooden benches, some leaning forward eagerly, while others fidgeted nervously. A few officers stood near the walls, their presence impossible to ignore. Their uniforms gleamed under the fluorescent lights, badges catching glimmers of reflection. To most people, these men and women might have looked authoritative, commanding, respect simply by standing there. But to Michelle, they were symbols of something much darker, a system that too often failed those it claimed to protect. She took her seat at the defense table, smoothing her blazer before pulling out her papers. Her assistant, Tasha, sat beside her, typing furiously on a laptop. "You ready?" Tasha asked softly, glancing up briefly. Michelle nodded, though she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping into her chest. Something about today felt off. Maybe it was the way certain deputies kept glancing in her direction, their expressions unreadable. Or maybe it was the hushed conversations happening between prosecutors and law enforcement officials near the front of the room. Whatever it was, Michelle knew better than to let it distract her. Focus, she reminded herself. Stay sharp. As the judge entered the courtroom and called the session to order, Michelle flipped through her notes one last time. She glanced across the aisle at the prosecution's table, where Officer Greg Hensley sat stoically. He was the same officer involved in Jamal's arrest, the one whose actions Michelle planned to scrutinize closely during cross-examination. Hensley's face gave nothing away, but Michelle could feel the weight of his gaze as he stared straight, ahead refusing to meet her eyes. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what he might be thinking. Was he nervous? Confident? Did he even realize how much rested on his testimony? What Michelle didn't know yet was that this day would spiral far beyond questions of guilt or innocence. Within hours, she would find herself at the center of a confrontation that would test her strength, resilience, and faith in the very system she worked so tirelessly to reform. But right now, all she could do was focus on the task at hand, defending Jamal and ensuring his voice was heard. Little did she know, her own voice would soon echo far beyond these courtroom walls, reaching places she never imagined possible. Time ticked by slowly as the proceedings began. Witnesses were called, testimonies were given, and objections were raised. Each moment seemed to stretch longer than the last, building anticipation among those in attendance. Michelle scribbled notes furiously, her pen moving across the page like a dancer performing a well-rehearsed routine. She listened intently to every word spoken, analyzing tone, body language, and phrasing. Nothing escaped her attention. Not the slight hesitation in a witness's answer, nor the flicker of discomfort on Officer Hensley's face when questioned about specific details of the night in question. But despite her focus, Michelle couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease settling over the room. There was an unspoken tension hanging in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. It was as if everyone knew something was coming, something big. And though Michelle couldn't predict exactly what that something would be, she braced herself anyway. Years of experience had taught her that life rarely followed a script, especially when you were fighting for justice in a world built to resist change. And then it happened. Just as Michelle leaned over to whisper something to Tasha, two uniformed deputies approached her table. Their boots echoed sharply against the tiled floor, drawing the attention of nearly everyone in the room. Michelle looked up, startled but composed. "Can I help you?" she asked calmly, though her heart began to race. What followed would become a pivotal moment, not just for Michelle, but for countless others watching from afar, waiting for someone brave enough to stand up and say, "Enough." The moment the two deputies approached Michelle's table, the energy in the courtroom shifted. What had been a tense but orderly atmosphere suddenly felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Everyone turned their heads to watch what would happen next. Michelle sat up straighter, her shoulders squared and her expression calm, though her mind raced with questions. Why were these officers interrupting now? Had something gone wrong? Or was this just another attempt to throw her off balance? One of the deputies, a tall man with a stern face, spoke first. His voice carried across the room, loud enough to draw even more attention. "Ma'am," he began, his tone clipped and formal, "we've received reports that you're causing a disturbance by speaking too loudly to your assistant." Michelle blinked, momentarily stunned. Speak too loudly? She glanced at Tasha, who looked equally confused. They hadn't raised their voices once during the entire proceeding. In fact, they'd been careful to keep their conversation quiet so as not to disrupt the court. This accusation made no sense. "I'm sorry," Michelle said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "But I don't believe that's accurate. We've been conducting ourselves appropriately throughout the session." Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a hint of defiance that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the room. The deputy frowned, clearly unimpressed by her response. "We've been instructed to ask you to leave the courtroom," he continued, ignoring her explanation entirely. "If you refuse, we'll have no choice but to escort you out." Michelle's heart pounded, but she refused to let fear take over. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, meeting the deputy's gaze head-on. "On whose authority?" she asked, sharply. "And based on what evidence? I haven't done anything wrong." Her question hung in the air, unanswered. The deputy hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing toward the prosecution's table where Officer Hensley sat watching silently. It was subtle, but Michelle caught the exchange. This wasn't about her behavior. It was about sending a message. About keeping her in line. Tasha placed a hand lightly on Michelle's arm, trying to signal caution. But Michelle wasn't backing down. Not here. Not now. "You can't just remove me without cause," she said firmly, addressing both, the deputies and the judge, who was observing the scene from his bench. "This is a public courtroom. My client has a constitutional right to representation, and I intend to fulfill my duty as his attorney." Her words resonated through the room, earning murmurs of agreement from some spectators, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The tension was palpable, like a rope being pulled tighter and tighter. The second deputy stepped closer, his posture rigid. "Ma'am, if you continue to resist, you're only making things worse for yourself," he warned, his voice low but firm. Michelle didn't flinch. She knew exactly what they were doing, trying to intimidate her into compliance. And while part of her wanted to argue further, another part recognized the danger of escalating the situation. If she pushed too hard, they might arrest her, which could jeopardize Jamal's case. But leaving quietly wasn't an option either. That would send the wrong message, not just to the deputies, but to everyone watching. So instead, Michelle stood up slowly, her movements deliberate. She faced the deputies directly, her chin lifted slightly. "Fine," she said, her tone icy. "I'll step outside, but know this. I'm not leaving because I've done anything wrong. I'm stepping out to ensure my client's rights aren't violated any further." Her declaration earned scattered applause from the gallery, quickly silenced by the bailiff's sharp command. As Michelle gathered her papers and turned toward the exit, she could feel dozens of eyes on her, some sympathetic, others hostile. Every step felt heavier than the last, but she kept her head high, refusing to show weakness. Once outside the courtroom doors, Michelle exhaled deeply, leaning against the wall for support. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her briefcase, adrenaline coursing through her veins. For a moment, she allowed herself to process what had just happened. This wasn't the first time she'd faced resistance in her career, but it was one of the most blatant attempts to silence her she'd ever experienced. It wasn't just about her, it was about sending a message to anyone else who dared to challenge the status quo. To Black women in particular, who often bore the brunt of such hostility simply for existing in spaces dominated by white men. As Michelle stood there, trying to compose herself, a young woman approached her cautiously. She introduced herself as a reporter covering the trial and asked if Michelle would be willing to comment on what had transpired inside. At first, Michelle hesitated. Speaking to the press could inflame the situation further, potentially putting her or her client at greater risk. But then she remembered something important. Visibility mattered. If people saw what was happening, if they understood the lengths to which some would go to maintain control, they might start asking questions that could lead to change. With that thought in mind, Michelle nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice strong despite the lingering tremor in her hands. "I'll talk, but not here. Let's find somewhere quieter." The reporter led her to a nearby conference room, where Michelle recounted the events calmly but passionately. She described how the deputies had accused her of disrupting the proceedings without evidence, how they'd tried to remove her despite her protests, and how the whole ordeal seemed designed to undermine her credibility. By the time she finished, tears glistened in her eyes, not from sadness but from frustration. Frustration at the injustice of it all. Frustration at having to fight so hard just to do her job. Word of the incident spread quickly. Within minutes, snippets of Michelle's interview appeared online, sparking outrage among viewers. Social media platforms lit up with hashtags like Stand with Michelle and Justice for All. People shared videos of the confrontation captured by other attendees, dissecting every detail. Some praised Michelle's composure under pressure. Others condemned the deputies' actions as yet another example of systemic bias. Activists began organizing protests outside the courthouse, demanding accountability and transparency. Meanwhile, Michelle's colleagues rallied around her, filing emergency motions to address the mistreatment and ensure she could return to court without interference. Back inside the courtroom, the disruption caused by Michelle's removal lingered like a shadow. The judge called for a short recess, giving everyone time to regroup. Officers whispered among themselves, casting uneasy glances toward the door Michelle had exited through. Spectators exchanged hushed conversations, speculating about what would happen next. Even Officer Hensley seemed distracted, fidgeting with his tie as if unsure how to proceed. For the first time since the trial began, the prosecution appeared rattled. When the session resumed, the mood was markedly different. The judge addressed the earlier incident briefly, reminding everyone present that decorum must be maintained. Yet his words rang hollow to many in the room, especially those who believed Michelle had been targeted unfairly. As the day wore on, it became clear that the confrontation had shifted the narrative. What had started as a routine trial was now a flashpoint, a moment that exposed cracks in the foundation of a system designed to protect privilege at the expense of equality. For Michelle, standing outside the courthouse later that evening, the weight of everything hit her all at once. She watched as protesters chanted her name, holding signs that read "Equal Justice Under Law" and "Black Voices Matter." Strangers approached her, thanking her for standing up not just for Jamal, but for them. It was overwhelming, but also empowering. For years, Michelle had fought tirelessly for justice, often feeling like she was shouting into the void. Now, for the first time, she realized she wasn't alone. There were thousands of people standing beside her, ready to amplify her voice and demand change. Little did Michelle know, however, that this was only the beginning. Yuen Feng. The aftermath of Michelle's removal from the courtroom rippled far beyond the courthouse walls. Within hours, the story had exploded online, fueled by the raw emotion captured in videos and interviews shared across social media platforms. People couldn't stop talking about it. The hashtag #HarborStandWithMichelle trended nationwide, drawing attention not only to her personal ordeal, but also to the larger issues of systemic racism and bias that had long plagued the justice system. For many, Michelle wasn't just an attorney fighting for her client. She was a symbol of resistance against oppression, someone who refused to back down even when the odds were stacked heavily against her. Outside the courthouse, a growing crowd gathered, holding signs and chanting slogans like "Justice over bias" and "Silence is complicity." Local activists joined forces with national organizations, amplifying the message through coordinated protests. Some held megaphones, their voices echoing through the streets as they called for accountability. Others distributed flyers explaining the details of Jamal's case and highlighting patterns of misconduct within the police department. It was a diverse coalition: Black, white, Latino, Asian, all united under one cause, demanding fairness and transparency. Inside the courthouse, tension simmered. Reporters buzzed around, eager to capture every detail of what promised to be a landmark trial. Judges and court staff exchanged uneasy glances, aware that all eyes were on them now. Meanwhile, Officer Greg Hensley sat stiffly at the prosecution's table, his usual confidence replaced by visible discomfort. He hadn't anticipated this level of scrutiny, or backlash. Every move he made seemed calculated, as if he were trying to avoid drawing more attention to himself. Even his colleagues appeared wary, whispering among themselves about how quickly things had spiraled out of control. For Michelle, the whirlwind of support felt both empowering and overwhelming. Back at her office later that evening, she scrolled through endless posts and messages from strangers thanking her for standing up. One comment stood out in particular. "You're not just fighting for Jamal, you're fighting for all of us." Those words stayed with her, resonating deeply. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about winning a case anymore. It was about exposing the cracks in a broken system and proving that change was possible. Her team worked tirelessly into the night, strategizing ways to counteract the attempts to discredit her and ensure she could return to court without further interference. They filed motions arguing that her removal violated both her rights and those of her client. Legal experts weighed in, offering advice and resources to bolster their efforts. Meanwhile, prominent civil rights attorneys reached out to offer support, pledging to stand beside Michelle if needed. It was clear that this case had become bigger than any single person. It was a movement. As Michelle prepared for the next day's proceedings, she reflected on the broader implications of what had happened. She thought about other Black women who had faced similar treatment, not just in courtrooms but in workplaces, schools, and everyday life. How often had they been dismissed or silenced simply because of their race and gender? How many times had their voices been ignored, their stories erased? Michelle realized that her fight wasn't just personal, it was collective. If she succeeded, it wouldn't just vindicate Jamal. It would send a powerful message to anyone who doubted their ability to challenge injustice. The following morning, Michelle arrived at the courthouse early, determined to reclaim her place at the defense table. A sea of supporters greeted her, cheering and clapping as she walked past. Children held handmade signs reading, "We believe you," while elders nodded solemnly, their faces etched with pride. Michelle smiled gratefully, though she couldn't shake the weight of responsibility, pressing down on her shoulders. So many people were counting on her now, Not just Jamal and his family, but everyone watching from afar, hoping for a glimmer of hope in a world that often felt hopeless. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The judge called the session to order, addressing the previous day's incident directly. "This is a court of law," he reminded everyone sternly. "All parties involved must conduct themselves with respect and professionalism." While his tone suggested neutrality, his words carried an underlying acknowledgement of the mounting pressure. Michelle returned to her seat, greeted by Tasha with a relieved smile. Together, they reviewed their notes, steeling themselves for what lay ahead. As the trial resumed, Michelle noticed subtle shifts in the atmosphere. Prosecutors seemed less confident, their arguments faltering under closer examination. Witnesses hesitated before answering questions as if suddenly aware of the stakes. And then there was Officer Hensley. When called to testify, he took the stand reluctantly, his demeanor markedly different from the day before. Gone was the swagger, replaced by a nervous energy that betrayed his unease. Michelle watched him carefully, noting every twitch, every pause, every glance toward his colleagues. She knew this was her moment to shine, to expose the truth hidden beneath layers of lies. During cross-examination, Michelle unleashed a barrage of pointed questions, each one designed to chip away at Hensley's credibility. She challenged inconsistencies in his account of the traffic stop, pointing out discrepancies between his testimony and body cam footage. She highlighted patterns of behavior documented in internal affairs reports, painting a picture of a man whose actions had repeatedly raised red flags. With every answer Hensley gave, cracks began to form in the prosecution's case. Spectators leaned forward, captivated by the drama unfolding before them. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every word. But Michelle didn't stop there. She turned her focus to the broader issue at hand, the culture of impunity that allowed officers like Hensley to operate unchecked. "Isn't it true," she asked during one pivotal exchange, "that your department has received numerous complaints regarding excessive force, particularly against black individuals?" Hensley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. "I'm not aware of specific numbers," he muttered evasively. Michelle pressed on, presenting evidence compiled by local advocacy groups showing alarming trends of racial profiling and misconduct. The room fell silent, the gravity of her argument sinking in. By the time Michelle concluded her questioning, the tide had clearly shifted. Where once the prosecution had seemed invincible, cracks now showed everywhere. Jurors exchanged meaningful looks, their expressions revealing doubts about the narrative they'd been presented. Even the judge appeared affected, nodding thoughtfully as Michelle summarized her points. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers, sensing victory on the horizon. For Michelle, it was a reminder of why she did what she did, not for fame or recognition, but because someone had to stand up. Someone had to say, "Enough." As the day drew to a close, Michelle stepped outside to address the assembled supporters. Her voice trembled slightly as she thanked them for their unwavering solidarity. "This isn't over yet," she said firmly. "But today proved something important. When we come together, we can challenge even the most entrenched systems of power. We can demand justice and we can win." The crowd roared its approval, lifting their signs high into the air. In that moment, Michelle realized that this fight wasn't just about the courtroom. It was about building a future where no one had to face the same battles alone, a future where equality wasn't just an ideal but a reality. The momentum from Michelle's powerful cross-examination of Officer Greg Hensley carried through the rest of the day, but it was nothing compared to what happened later that evening. Back at her office, Michelle sat surrounded by stacks of legal documents and notes, trying to process everything that had unfolded. The courtroom drama, the protests outside, the overwhelming support pouring in from across the country. It all felt surreal. Despite the exhaustion weighing on her shoulders, she couldn't stop thinking about Jamal, his family, and the countless others who looked to her as a beacon of hope. Just as Michelle was about to call it a night, her phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at the screen, expecting another message from a colleague or supporter. But when she saw the unknown number flashing, curiosity got the better of her. "Hello?" she answered cautiously, bracing herself for anything. "Ms. Carter, this is President Rachel Monroe," came the voice on the other end. Michelle froze, her breath catching in her throat. President Monroe, the first black woman to hold the highest office in the nation, was calling her. It took every ounce of composure not to drop the phone in shock. "Yes, Madam President," Michelle managed to reply, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. President Monroe wasted no time with pleasantries. "I want you to know that I've been following your case closely," she said firmly. "What happened to you in that courtroom yesterday was unacceptable. No one should face such blatant attempts to silence them, especially when they're standing up for justice." Her words struck a chord deep within Michelle, validating everything she had felt during those tense moments when deputies tried to remove her. Michelle listened intently as the president continued. "You're doing important work, Ms. Carter. Work that reminds us why we need voices like yours, not just in courtrooms but everywhere. This country needs people willing to challenge the status quo and fight for what's right, even when it's hard." There was a pause before President Monroe added softly, "And I want you to know, you're not alone in this." Tears welled up in Michelle's eyes as she absorbed the weight of the president's words. For so long, she had carried the burden of these battles on her own, determined to push forward despite the obstacles. Hearing someone in such a position of power acknowledge her struggle and affirm its importance felt like a lifeline. "Thank you, Madam President," Michelle said, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than I can say." The conversation didn't last long, but its impact was profound. After hanging up, Michelle sat in stunned silence, replaying every word in her mind. She thought about how far she had come, from growing up in a small town where opportunities often felt out of reach, to becoming a civil rights attorney fighting for justice on a national stage. And now, here she was, receiving encouragement directly from the leader of the free world. It wasn't just validation, it was fuel, a reminder that her efforts mattered not only to those immediately affected but to the entire nation. News of the call leaked almost immediately, thanks to an aide close to the president who believed the public deserved to know. Within minutes, headlines blared across news outlets. "President calls civil rights attorney amid high-profile trial." Social media erupted once again, with millions celebrating the symbolic gesture. Supporters hailed it as a turning point, proof that change could happen when those in power stood alongside marginalized communities. Critics, however, accused the president of overstepping boundaries, claiming her involvement politicized the trial. But Michelle paid little attention to the backlash. To her, the call represented something much bigger than politics. It was solidarity. The next morning, Michelle returned to the courthouse feeling reinvigorated. If she had doubted her resolve before, there was no trace of uncertainty now. As she walked past the cheering crowd gathered outside, she raised a hand in gratitude, drawing louder applause. Inside, reporters jostled for position, eager to capture her reaction to the president's endorsement. But Michelle remained focused, channeling her energy into preparing for the final stages of the trial. During the proceedings, the prosecution seemed increasingly flustered, struggling to regain control of the narrative. Their witnesses faltered, under Michelle's relentless questioning, unable to provide consistent answers. Meanwhile, Michelle's team introduced new evidence that further undermined the state's case, including expert testimony highlighting flaws in police procedures and eyewitness accounts, contradicting Officer Hensley's version of events. Each revelation chipped away at the prosecution's credibility, leaving jurors visibly conflicted. By mid-afternoon, the judge called for a recess, giving everyone a chance to regroup. Michelle used the break to speak briefly with Tasha and her colleagues, strategizing their closing arguments. "We have them on the ropes," Tasha said confidently, "but we need to seal the deal. Make sure they understand exactly what's at stake here." Michelle nodded, her mind already racing with ideas. This wasn't just about proving Jamal's innocence. It was about exposing the systemic failures that allowed cases like his to exist in the first place. When the session resumed, Michelle delivered her closing statement with unwavering conviction. Standing tall before the jury, she painted a vivid picture of the injustices Jamal faced, not as isolated incidents, but as part of a larger pattern of discrimination and abuse. She reminded them of the evidence presented, the inconsistencies in testimonies, and the broader implications of their decision. "This isn't just about one man," she said passionately. "It's about whether we live in a society where fairness prevails, or one where fear and prejudice dictate our choices." Her words resonated deeply, earning nods of agreement from spectators and even a few jurors. Outside the courtroom, the crowd watched live updates on their phones, holding their breath as deliberations began. Hours passed, each minute feeling longer than the last. Finally, the jury announced they had reached a verdict. As the foreman stood to deliver the decision, Michelle clasped her hands tightly together, steeling herself for whatever came next. "On the charge of assaulting an officer," he began, pausing dramatically, "we find the defendant not guilty." The room erupted in cheers, tears streaming down faces as relief washed over everyone present. Jamal hugged his family, overcome with emotion, while Michelle exchanged triumphant smiles with her team. Outside, the celebration spilled into the streets, with chants of "Justice prevails" echoing through the air. For Michelle, the victory was bittersweet. While she rejoiced in Jamal's exoneration, she knew the fight wasn't over. Systemic racism wouldn't disappear overnight, nor would the biases ingrained in institutions across the country. But today proved something vital. Progress was possible. With courage, determination, and unity, people could challenge injustice and create meaningful change. As Michelle stepped outside to join the jubilant crowd, she reflected on the journey that brought her here. From being forcibly removed from the courtroom to receiving a call from the White House, every moment had shaped her understanding of resilience and purpose. She realized that this case wasn't just about winning. It was about inspiring others to stand up, speak out, and refuse to stay silent in the face of inequality. Because sometimes all it took was one person saying enough to spark a movement. And Michelle Carter had proven that she was ready to lead the charge. The verdict echoed through the courthouse like a thunderclap, sending waves of emotion rippling across the room. For Michelle Carter, it was more than just a legal victory. It was vindication. As the jury declared Jamal not guilty, she felt the weight of months of preparation, late nights, and relentless determination lift off her shoulders. But this wasn't just about relief. It was about justice served, not just for Jamal, but for every person who had ever been wronged by a system that too often favored power over fairness. Outside, the celebration grew louder. Protesters turned into revelers, dancing and cheering, in the streets as news of the verdict spread. Strangers hugged one another, tears streaming down their faces. Jamal's family stood at the center of it all, holding him close as cameras flashed around them. Reporters shouted questions, trying to capture the moment, but the joy on everyone's faces spoke louder than words. For many in the crowd, this was more than a court decision. It was hope made tangible. Hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. Back inside the courtroom, Michelle took a quiet moment to herself. She leaned against the defense table, letting the reality sink in. This case had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated, professionally, emotionally, even physically. Being removed from the courtroom, facing hostility from law enforcement, enduring criticism from skeptics, all of it had pushed her to her limits. But standing there now, surrounded by supporters and colleagues, she realized something important. None of it would have been worth it if she hadn't stayed true to her values. Every challenge had strengthened her resolve, reminding her why she chose this path in the first place. As the crowd outside continued to celebrate, Michelle stepped onto the courthouse steps to address them. The sea of people stretched far beyond what she'd expected, filling the street with signs, banners, and chants of gratitude. When she raised her hand to speak, the noise gradually softened, giving way to an expectant silence. Today is not just about one man, she began, her voice carrying over the murmurs. It's about proving that no matter how powerful the forces stacked against us may seem, we can still fight back. We can still demand truth. And we can still win. Her words ignited applause so loud it seemed to shake the very foundation of the building behind her. People clapped, whistled, and cheered, their energy electric. Michelle paused, allowing the moment to settle before continuing. But let's be clear, this isn't the end. Winning this trial doesn't mean our work is done. Far from it. There are still countless Jamals out there waiting for someone to stand up for them, waiting for justice. Her tone shifted slightly, growing firmer. So today we celebrate. Tomorrow, we keep fighting. The speech resonated deeply, earning praise not only from those present, but also from viewers watching online. Clips of her remarks went viral almost instantly, drawing millions of views and sparking renewed conversations about systemic racism and police accountability. News outlets hailed her as a hero, while social media users flooded her accounts with messages of admiration and support. For Michelle, though, none of that mattered as much as the knowledge that her actions had inspired others to believe in the possibility of change. In the days that followed, Michelle became a household name. Invitations poured in, from universities, asking her to deliver keynote speeches, organizations seeking her expertise, and even late-night talk shows eager to feature her story. At first she hesitated, unsure whether stepping into the spotlight aligned with her mission. But after consulting with Tasha and her team, she decided to embrace the opportunity, not for fame, but to amplify her message. If sharing her experience could encourage others to take action, then it was worth it. One of her first major appearances was at a national conference on criminal justice reform. Standing on stage in front of thousands of attendees, Michelle recounted her journey, the challenges she faced, the moments of doubt, and ultimately, the triumph that came from refusing to give up. Change doesn't happen overnight, she told the audience. It happens step by step, case by case, until suddenly you look around and realize the world has shifted. That's what happened here. Not because I did anything extraordinary, but because ordinary people refused to stay silent. Her speech earned a standing ovation, cementing her status as a leading voice in the movement for equality. From there, opportunities multiplied. She traveled across the country, speaking at schools, community centers, and legislative hearings. Everywhere she went, she emphasized the importance of grassroots activism, urging people to get involved in local efforts to hold institutions accountable. You don't need a law degree to make a difference, she often said. All you need is courage and a willingness to stand up when it matters most. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of the trial continued to spread. In response to public outcry, city officials launched investigations into the police department's practices, uncovering years of misconduct and racial bias. Officers implicated in wrongdoing were suspended or fired, while new policies aimed at increasing transparency and accountability were implemented. Though critics argued these changes didn't go far enough, Michelle saw them as a starting point, a sign that pressure from below could yield results. At the same time, Michelle used her newfound platform to advocate for broader reforms. She partnered with civil rights organizations to draft legislation addressing systemic issues within law enforcement, including mandatory body cameras, independent oversight boards, and stricter penalties for misconduct. Lawmakers, eager to capitalize on the momentum generated by her case, introduced bills based on her proposals, sparking debates in state houses nationwide. While progress was slow, each small victory reinforced her belief that persistence paid off. Despite the whirlwind of attention, Michelle remained grounded. She returned to her office daily, taking on new cases and mentoring young attorneys of color, eager to follow in her footsteps. To her, the real heroes weren't the ones giving speeches or appearing on TV. It was the everyday people working tirelessly behind the scenes to create a fairer, more just society. She made it a point to remind everyone she met that change required collective effort, not individual glory. One evening, as Michelle sat at her desk reviewing files for an upcoming case, her phone buzzed again. It was another unknown number, but this time she answered without hesitation. "Hello?" she said, expecting yet another well-wisher or journalist. Instead, a familiar voice greeted her. "Ms. Carter, it's President Monroe again." Michelle smiled, warmth flooding her chest. Over the course of their conversation, the president thanked her for her continued advocacy and assured her that the White House would support any future initiatives she pursued. "We're watching closely," President Monroe said, "and we're counting on leaders like you to guide us forward." After hanging up, Michelle stared at her reflection in the window, feeling both humbled and empowered. She thought about how far she'd come since that fateful day when deputies tried to remove her from the courtroom. What had started as a personal battle had evolved into a national movement, one that showed no signs of slowing down. And though the road ahead remained long and uncertain, Michelle knew one thing for sure: she wasn't alone anymore. Whether it was the protesters chanting her name, the activists organizing rallies, or the president calling to offer encouragement, she had built a network of allies committed to the same cause. As she packed up her things and headed home, Michelle allowed herself a rare moment of optimism. Change was possible, slow, messy, imperfect, but possible. And as long as there were people willing to fight for it, the arc of history would continue bending toward justice. For Michelle Carter, that was enough. Months turned into years, and Michelle Carter's life transformed in ways she could never have imagined. What started as a single courtroom battle became a lifelong mission, a journey that took her from the quiet corners of a small southern courthouse to the national stage, where her voice reached millions. But for Michelle, success wasn't measured by headlines or accolades. It was measured by impact. The lives changed, the systems reformed, and the hope ignited in communities across the country. In the years following Jamal's trial, Michelle dedicated herself to mentoring the next generation of civil rights attorneys. She opened a nonprofit organization called Voices for Justice, designed to provide resources, training, and support to young lawyers from underrepresented backgrounds. Her goal was simple yet profound: to ensure that no one else had to face the same barriers she had encountered early in her career. Every Saturday morning, Michelle hosted workshops at community centers, teaching aspiring advocates how to navigate the complexities of the legal system while staying true to their values. "The law is a tool," she often said during these sessions, "but it's only as powerful as the hands that wield it." Her efforts quickly gained traction. Students traveled from neighboring states to attend her seminars, eager to learn, not just about courtroom strategies, but also about resilience, empathy, and leadership. One of her protégés, a young woman named Maya, went on to win a landmark discrimination case against a major corporation, crediting Michelle with giving her the confidence to pursue justice fearlessly. "She taught me that being an attorney isn't just about winning cases," Maya told reporters after the verdict. "It's about standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible." Beyond mentoring, Michelle continued advocating for systemic reforms. Her partnership with lawmakers led to the passage of several key pieces of legislation aimed at increasing accountability within law enforcement agencies. Mandatory body cameras became standard practice nationwide, and independent oversight boards were established to review complaints against officers. While critics argued that these measures didn't go far enough, Michelle saw them as stepping stones toward larger change. "Progress isn't perfect," she reminded audiences during speeches, "but every step forward matters." Michelle's influence extended beyond policy reform. She wrote a memoir titled "Enough: Standing Up When the Odds Are Against You," detailing her experiences in and out of the courtroom. The book became an instant bestseller, praised for its raw honesty and inspiring message. Readers connected deeply with her reflections on fear, faith, and perseverance, finding solace in her reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. Schools added the memoir to their curriculums, using it as a teaching tool to spark discussions about racial equity and social justice. As her fame grew, so did her responsibilities. Michelle frequently appeared on television panels, engaging in debates about civil rights issues with politicians, activists, and scholars. Her calm demeanor and sharp intellect earned her respect even among opponents, many of whom admitted privately that her arguments forced them to reconsider long-held beliefs. Yet despite her growing prominence, Michelle remained approachable. Fans often shared stories of meeting her at events or rallies, describing her warmth and willingness to listen. "She makes you feel like your voice matters," one supporter said. "Like you can make a difference too." One of the most significant milestones came when Michelle received an invitation to speak at the White House during a special ceremony honoring trailblazers in civil rights. Standing on the podium, flanked by President Monroe and other dignitaries, Michelle reflected on how far she'd come since that fateful phone call years earlier. "When I first stood in that courtroom, I didn't know if anyone would hear me," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Today, I stand here knowing that my voice, and yours, is powerful enough to move mountains." The audience erupted in applause, tears streaming down faces as people rose to their feet. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came not from awards or titles, but from the countless individuals whose lives Michelle touched directly. Letters poured in daily, each one sharing a story of struggle and triumph inspired by her example. A mother wrote to thank Michelle for helping her son secure representation after he was wrongfully accused of theft. A teenager described how Michelle's speeches motivated him to join his school's debate team, where he now championed causes close to his heart. An elderly man expressed gratitude for her unwavering commitment to preserving human dignity, saying simply, "You remind us that we're all worthy of respect." Despite her achievements, Michelle never lost sight of why she started this journey. She returned regularly to the town where Jamal's trial took place, checking in on local activists working to dismantle remnants of systemic bias. On one visit, she attended a community meeting where residents discussed plans to rename a park in honor of victims of police brutality. As she listened to their ideas, Michelle felt a surge of pride, not for herself, but for the collective spirit driving the movement forward. Change wasn't happening because of one person. It was happening because thousands of people refused to give up. Years later, Michelle found herself standing before a crowd once again, this time addressing a group of students at a historically Black university. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as she walked onto the stage, wearing the same blazer she'd worn during Jamal's trial. Her presence commanded silence, not through authority, but through reverence. "When I look at all of you," she began, scanning the sea of hopeful faces, "I see the future. Leaders who will challenge injustice, amplify silenced voices, and create a world where fairness prevails." Her speech concluded with a call to action, one that echoed the words she'd spoken outside the courthouse years ago. "Change doesn't ask for permission," she said firmly. "It demands courage, so don't wait for someone else to fix what's broken. Stand up, speak out, and remember, when you fight for justice, you're never truly alone." As the audience erupted in cheers, Michelle stepped back, allowing the moment to settle. For her, this wasn't the end of a story. It was the continuation of a legacy rooted in resilience, hope, and the unshakable belief that together, ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things. And as she walked off stage, surrounded by students eager to shake her hand and share their dreams, Michelle knew one thing for certain: the fight for justice would endure, as long as there were voices brave enough to carry it forward.